What makes 18 ordinary soldiers hold a position that every military calculation says should already be lost? History usually remembers great battles through massive offensives, famous generals, and sweeping campaigns stretching across entire continents. Yet military professionals often pay attention to something much smaller: a single hill, a single platoon, a handful of soldiers whose actions quietly change the course of a much larger operation. Because in modern warfare, campaigns are often decided not only by armies, but by whether one small defensive position holds long enough for everything behind it to continue functioning. During the spring of 1944, as Allied forces fought their way north through Italy, one such position became the focus of repeated German attacks. The engagement never became as famous as Normandy or Bastogne. It produced no iconic photographs, no celebrated speeches, and very little public attention after the war. Yet among military historians, it remains an extraordinary example of how leadership, preparation, and small-minus unit cohesion can outweigh overwhelming numerical odds. The battle took place during one of the most difficult campaigns of the Second World War. Unlike the rapid advances across France that would come later in 1944, Italy offered almost none of the advantages normally associated with mobile warfare. Every valley narrowed movement. Every ridgeline became a natural fortress. Every river crossing forced attacking forces into predictable routes that defenders had already prepared to cover with artillery and machine-gun fire. German Commander Field Marshal Albert Kesselring understood this terrain exceptionally well. Rather than relying solely on numbers, he transformed the Italian mountains into a layered defensive system designed to slow every Allied advance. Instead of defeating Allied armies outright, the objective was simpler and in many ways more effective. Force them to fight for every hill. Force them to spend days capturing positions that looked insignificant on the map. Force them to consume time and manpower faster than they could replace them. For the Allied Fifth Army, advancing through Italy became less a campaign of sweeping offensives than an exhausting sequence of localized battles. Every ridge overlooked another valley. Every captured hill exposed another defensive line farther north. Progress was measured not in hundreds of kilometers, but sometimes at only a few hundred meters. Within this environment, seemingly minor defensive positions often carried importance far beyond their size. One such position overlooked a narrow approach that German planners hoped to use for future maneuver. On paper, the American force occupying the ridge appeared remarkably small. Only a handful of infantrymen remained in prepared positions after previous fighting had reduced the unit's strength. The German battalion assigned to seize the position possessed every apparent advantage: superior manpower, mortar support, experienced infantry, a coordinated assault plan. Under ordinary circumstances, the outcome appeared straightforward. Military doctrine generally assumes that isolated infantry positions eventually collapse when confronted by repeated attacks from significantly larger forces. Casualties accumulate, communications deteriorate, ammunition declines. Eventually, the defenders lose cohesion. German officers had seen this pattern countless times across Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. Nothing suggested this engagement would unfold differently. Yet almost immediately, events began challenging those assumptions. Rather than defending passively, the American soldiers had spent previous days studying every contour of the ridgeline. Fields of fire overlapped naturally. Machine-gun positions covered likely avenues of approach. Riflemen understood exactly where advancing infantry would first become visible. Instead of reacting to the attack, they had already anticipated where it would develop. This preparation transformed a small defensive force into something considerably more effective than its numbers suggested. Modern military analysts sometimes refer to this as combat multiplication. Firepower alone matters. Terrain matters. Training matters. But when each reinforces the others, the effectiveness of a small unit can increase dramatically. The German assault began with supporting mortar fire intended to suppress defenders before infantry advanced uphill. From a planning perspective, the sequence made perfect sense. Suppress, advance, overwhelm, secure the objective. Instead, the assault encountered disciplined defensive fire almost immediately. Rather than firing indiscriminately, American soldiers waited until attacking troops entered carefully selected engagement areas. Every burst of machine-gun fire covered ground that had already been measured. Every rifleman understood his assigned sector. The result surprised the attackers. Instead of encountering scattered resistance, they faced a coordinated defense whose limited firepower appeared significantly larger than it actually was. German soldiers later described the experience as confusing rather than simply dangerous. The volume of fire itself was not extraordinary. Its accuracy was. Whenever one assault element attempted to maneuver, Another defensive position engaged it from a different angle. Every apparent opening seemed already covered. The first attack stalled. German officers reorganized their companies, adjusted supporting fire, and prepared another assault. Again, military logic suggested the defenders would now begin weakening. Repeated attacks generally exhaust isolated infantry. Ammunition decreases, fatigue increases, leadership becomes more difficult. Yet the opposite seemed to occur. Each successive assault encountered defenders who continued operating with remarkable coordination despite growing pressure. From the German perspective, this was a most unexpected development. Experienced officers rarely judged enemy units by individual acts of bravery. Those existed in every army. Instead, professionals looked for organizational behavior. How quickly did defenders recover after disruption? Did leadership disappear when casualties occurred? Could small groups continue fighting independently if communications failed? These questions mattered far more than isolated moments of courage. During repeated attacks against the ridge, German commanders increasingly concluded they were facing an unusually well-prepared infantry position, rather than merely a determined one. Leadership appeared decentralized. Individual soldiers adjusted positions without waiting for detailed instructions. Fire discipline remained consistent. Momentum never entirely disappeared. That observation would become increasingly important as the battle continued. Because if the first assault could be explained as effective preparation, the second might be attributed to discipline. The third forced German commanders to consider another possibility entirely. Perhaps they were facing an organization whose strength depended less on numbers than on the ability of ordinary soldiers to continue functioning after conditions had already become extraordinarily difficult. By the time the third assault began, the battle had changed in ways that neither side had anticipated. The Germans still possessed the numerical advantage. They still controlled supporting mortars. They still had enough experienced infantry to continue pressing the attack. What they no longer possessed was certainty. Military operations depend on expectations. Commanders build plans around assumptions of how opposing forces are likely to react under pressure. Every additional assault against the ridge was supposed to weaken the defenders. Instead, each attack revealed something increasingly difficult to explain. The Americans were not simply surviving. They were adapting. Whenever casualties forced one position to fall silent, another rifleman shifted to cover the gap. When one firing point became too exposed, the defense adjusted almost instinctively without waiting for detailed instructions. To German observers watching from below, the ridgeline appeared to reorganize itself after every attack. Years of military training had taught German officers that disciplined command flowed from the top downward. Destroy communications, eliminate leaders, break organization. Eventually resistance collapsed. Yet on this ridge, leadership seemed distributed rather than concentrated. Small groups continued operating independently while still contributing to the overall defense. For professional soldiers, this was perhaps the most unsettling discovery of the entire engagement. Modern armies often describe this concept as decentralized initiative. Individual soldiers understand not only their immediate task, but also the larger purpose behind it. When circumstances change, they do not wait for perfect instructions. They continue pursuing the mission using their own judgment. Long before the term became common in modern military doctrine, that principle was already demonstrating its value on isolated battlefields like this one. The 4th German assault represented the final attempt to seize the position through direct infantry attacks. Additional troops reinforced the assault companies. Supporting fires intensified. Every available resource was concentrated against fewer than 24 defenders. From a purely mathematical perspective, the outcome should finally have favored the attackers. Instead, something else occurred. Repeated failures had begun affecting German morale as much as American ammunition shortages threatened the defenders. Every unsuccessful assault increased uncertainty. Every failed advance forced commanders to reconsider assumptions that had guided their planning only hours earlier. Combat effectiveness depends not only on physical strength but also on confidence. Once soldiers begin questioning whether an objective can actually be taken, even overwhelming numerical superiority becomes increasingly difficult to translate into battlefield success. The finalists all reached the upper slopes before being stopped. Fighting became exceptionally close. Grenades replaced longer range fire. Individual fighting positions became isolated from one another. Yet the overall defensive line never disintegrated. Instead of collapsing into confusion, the defenders continued supporting one another through overlapping fires and rapid movement between positions whenever opportunities appeared. Eventually, the attacking force disengaged. For the first time that day, silence returned to the ridge. The hill remained in American hands. From a strategic perspective, The immediate consequences appeared modest. One ridge, one battalion delayed, one day's fighting in a campaign already filled with similar engagements. But campaigns are often shaped by accumulated delays rather than dramatic breakthroughs. A battalion committed unsuccessfully against one objective cannot simultaneously support operations elsewhere. Replacement troops require time. New attack plans require coordination. Momentum, once lost, is rarely recovered immediately. In mountainous warfare, a single day's delay can alter the timing of operations across an entire sector. That is why professional militaries study engagements like this long after wars have ended. Not because 18 soldiers changed the entire course of the Italian campaign by themselves, but because they demonstrated principles that remained relevant regardless of era or technology. The German after-minus action analysis reportedly focused less on American firepower than on organizational behavior. Again and again, surviving officers attempted to explain why repeated attacks had failed despite favorable conditions. Their conclusions consistently pointed towards several interconnected factors: preparation, leadership, discipline, small-minus unit cohesion. None of these qualities appeared extraordinary by themselves. Together, however, they produced a defensive system considerably stronger than the number of men occupying it. That distinction matters. History often celebrates courage because courage is visible. Competence is quieter. It is built during training rather than battle. It appears in rehearsed movements, disciplined fire control, careful planning, and trust developed long before the first shot is fired. By the time combat begins, those habits often matter more than individual acts of heroism. The ridge illustrated another enduring lesson. Terrain never fights alone. Mountains, rivers, forests, and cities only become advantages when soldiers understand how to use them. The defenders did not succeed simply because they occupied higher ground. They succeeded because they had studied it. They knew where attackers would appear. They understood which positions supported one another. They transformed geography into combat power. That principle remains unchanged in modern warfare. Technology continues evolving. Weapons become more precise. Sensors become more capable. Yet soldiers still fight from terrain. Commanders still search for advantageous positions. Preparation still determines whether favorable ground becomes an opportunity or merely another location on a map. The engagement also challenged another common misconception. People often imagine battlefield resilience as something emotional, a refusal to surrender born entirely from courage. Professional soldiers usually describe it differently. Resilience is largely organizational. It grows from confidence in training, confidence in teammates, confidence that every individual understands the mission even when communications fail or leaders become casualties. When those foundations exist, units continue functioning under extraordinary pressure. When they do not, numerical superiority alone rarely guarantees success. The defenders on that ridge were not superhuman. They experienced fear. They suffered casualties. They faced dwindling supplies and repeated attacks from a much larger force. What distinguished them was not the absence of fear, but their ability to continue performing despite it. That difference is subtle. It is also one of the defining characteristics separating effective military organizations from merely large ones.